Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to get away from Britain and to be in Europe, and it's particularly nice to be able to say I look forward to seeing the many educators in the room become museum and gallery directors, because of course Maria Balshaw, who is the incoming director at Tate, replacing Sir Nick Sirota, had a background in museum education. So there you are. And I also particularly want to say a huge thank you to my interpreters, without whom I wouldn't have understood a lot today, and I hope they'll help clarify what I'm saying. Just to answer the Middlesex and the backdoor factor, one of the things that will be sort of weaving behind what I'm saying is a question around the individual and the institution in an era of corporatized statutory sectors where redundancy is normalized and where one is precarious, whether one is a security guard or whether one is a director. And so I just want to acknowledge that actually I'm not really from Middlesex. I'm really, in my own terms, post-institutional. Gallery education still frequently reveals traces of 1970s feminist emphasis on giving voice or finding your voice, interrogating the concept of the universal and historic conventions of democratic representation in the museum. Now, I haven't tried this stupidly. There we are. I want to consider this concept in relation to gallery education when I was employed at Tate Britain between 2003 and 2010, and in continuing collaborative projects, including one with a Syrian artist living in Damascus, which came out of an original Tate project, Naknu Together. I want to explore some ambiguities in relation to the authority of the individual artist and the institutional museum. In particular, I want to think about how improvisation, which is identified with modernism, informs a contemporary dialogic process that resists the managerialist procedures associated with project management and bureaucratic partnerships. I'm currently making what I'm calling an impossible artwork with the person I now call Amal Anon, who is both a friend and a former colleague who lives in Damascus. She used to run a small informal art school for children and adults in Damascus when I was running Tate Britain's Interpretation and Education Department. And together we led a durational collaborative art project based in mutual learning with support from the British Council. We have been working for some years on trying to make the impossible artwork. Recently, thinking about my own shame about not having yet realized the work, I turned to Primo Levi. I noted his passing comment about the wounds on people's feet who are forced to walk for miles. He was illuminating about the literal quality of the word impediment, which comes from the Latin word for foot. I've made a list of the impediments I've observed in making the work with my Syrian colleague, which I will share with you. By coincidence, Amal Anon is confined within a very limited area of Damascus and sends me scraps of video. Goodness me, you're so ill. And sends me scraps of video of pavements and people's feet as she walks past them. She masks her filming by pretending to text on her mobile phone, as it is now too dangerous for her to overtly film or photograph in the streets. Looking at these videos, I realized that the lack of freedom to represent a horizon signifies a present with no visible future. She endorsed this. In that sense, she is like those asylum seekers who manage amazingly to get to Britain, for whom the government, in the words of Theresa May, has created what she's called a hostile environment. Whether incarcerated or apparently free to walk the streets, asylum seekers are placed in what is known as indefinite detention, a state of not knowing when a decision might be taken about your request for asylum. This state of indefinite detention is considered too inhumane for criminals. I suggest that many living in Syria, as well as those Syrians who are deemed to be refugees, are living in indefinite detention. I want to relate the work I'm making with Amal Anon to questions of voice and to think about the distinction between individual and institutional partnerships. And I'm very aware of the voice I'm using today, which is post-institutional. It can change. First, here is my list to date of the impediments, in which I have referred to myself as Claire Light. These may be suggestive for more formal museum partnerships in their negotiations with people. 1, the differential power. 2, language. Amal Anon has had limited access to practicing the English she started to learn as an adult when we originally started working together. Claire Light speaks no Arabic. 3, the war in Syria, statutory espionage and terror. Amal Anon is in a condition of intense danger unimaginable to Claire Light. All communication is unsafe. 4, bite-sized communication through Facebook. Occasional poor quality Skype, no vision, emails unsafe to use, mail unsafe to use. 5, frequent cuts in the electricity supply in Damascus, frequent internet failures, and of course you'll know that they don't have water at the moment. 6, cultural organization of time. Amal Anon is out at work during the day, at home in the evening. Her movements are restricted by roadblocks, bombing, police state surveillance, and other forms of cultural geographic restriction, and by time. Claire Light frequently works at home in the day, lives in 2 places, travels or works, networks, or socializes in the evening. She manages time by schedules and arrangements. These are frequently fractured by technological and other Syrian impairments. 7, age. Claire Light repeatedly fails to understand technology, especially as her memory weakens. Amal Anon understands it better, but can't access the range of technology and its communication systems available to Claire Light. We are dependent on technology for communication and to make the impossible artwork. 8, different experience and understanding of art's infrastructure in Damascus and London. Through working in and around the London art world for 4 decades, Claire Light has a well-entrenched set of real and imagined borders not necessarily visible to Amal Anon. 9, novelty. We are trying to work in multiple ways that are all new to both of us. 10, our education and understanding of art is quite different, although we were both trained in modernist values. Through Natnu Together, we began to explore our understanding of contemporary art and its relation to globalization. Both contemporary and the new global art were new to Amal Anon when we met in 2004. Making the impossible artwork is a form of continuing our initial exchange, although our Skype conversations can't usually accommodate this in any depth. 11, fear of the other and of the self, played out as fear of offending, fear of endangering, fear of misrepresenting, fear of betrayal, fear of not doing things well enough. 12, travel for Amal Anon is impossible. Travel to Syria for Claire Light is impossible. Meeting is impossible. 13, gender. Restrictions for Amal Anon, which are real and are difficult for Claire Light to imagine and for either of them to discuss. 14, style of working friendship. Lack of familiarity with each other's cultural conventions of privacy and dignity, as well as the power imbalance between them, or between us, I should say. For instance, suggested by the distinction in our personal freedom, reinforced many of the other impediments. This can restrict the depth to which we work together. 15, it is difficult to make work together when you can't discuss it while you are both looking at it. 16, identity politics as it applies to Amal Anon in Syria and distinctly in Britain. Identity politics as it applies to Claire Light in Britain. 17, funding. Amal Anon is not eligible for any funding from Western trusts or governments because they refuse to support Syrians in Syria while Assad is president. Claire Light is concerned that if she raises funds to work at a professional funding level, the impossible artwork will become lopsided towards her and the West. 18. At critical moments of concentration on the impossible artwork, Claire Light feels as if she is the West. This feeling blocks her from working. Amal Anon doubtless has her own psychological blocks that she doesn't reveal to Claire Light. I worked at Tate, excuse me. I worked at Tate between 2003 and 2010. Early on, I contributed to a project to develop in-gallery interpretation to explore hybridity between Muslim and Christian visual references in the collection displays. A senior curator made it clear that although her expertise included British Orientalist painting, she was wary of developing such a project because she had no expertise in Islamic art. The catalytic role of the education department became clear to me. To forego a claim to specialist expertise in particular disciplines in order to develop processes of research, exchange, mutual learning, and improvisation with and for the museum. In this sense, it was comparable to an artistic practice. The fact that media communications usually promote exhibitions, artists, and the collection, typically leaving education under the radar, can thus be useful. The department's voice may not be well known, but it can be directed strategically. Experimenting and continuing reflexive practice helped inform a cross-cultural strategy developed with the department, which I had decided would be a key focus of my work at Tate. Interpretation was an obvious way to experiment with voice, aiming to avoid the didactic and to avoid translating the visual into the verbal. We made use of the considerable research already undertaken into the effective use of information and text, as well as trialing different forms of interpretation from multiple voices. By 2005, Sarah Hyde was experimenting with an online project titled Write Your Own Label, which invited specialist and/or personal interpretations of particular works to share with other gallery visitors, and some of these would be cross-disciplinary. In 2008, when Christine Riding curated the exhibition British Orientalist Painting, the curator of interpretation, Jennifer Batchelor, developed an interactive exploring the Western predisposition to map the Orient, as well as producing some interpretive labels from 3 different perspectives for particular works, memorably landscapes, buildings, and their peopled interiors in and around Jerusalem. The 3 different perspectives represented views developed with Muslim, Jewish, and Christian writers, some of which aired continuing frictions. One-off projects paved the way for more durational and more strategic projects and programs. The 5-year national program Visual Dialogues, produced with 4 regional art museums, as well as Tate Britain, invited groups of young people to develop new interpretation around particular works in the museum's collections. In 2008, at Birmingham City Museum and Art Gallery, young female school students, mostly of Muslim heritage, worked with artist Juno Projects to reveal, for instance, that a realist Levantine landscape painting was fictionalized and not, as might be generally assumed, documentary. In 2005, at Tate Britain, a group of school students from a range of religious and secular backgrounds worked in the Visual Dialogues program with artist Sarah Khan to interpret David Hockney's Third Love painting, including representations of graffiti in men's toilets before homosexuality was legal. Hockney's painting gave voice to illicit sexual codes, which the school students decided to reinterpret. Sometimes young people appeared to mimic better recognized voices. When we displayed a series of photographs by young people working with artist Faisal Abdullah, a gallery patron mistook them for the work of prize-winning British-Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibari. But voice was contentious. When a technical fault temporarily eliminated the subtitles on a film I'd made interviewing Syrian and Jordanian artists and curators, an Arab colleague assumed I hadn't bothered to subtitle, seeing this as a silencing. On the other hand, when my colleague Matty Pai produced a film made by Gail Chong Kwan with young mothers, including asylum seekers, Matty argued that it would be offensive to subtitle despite problems with audibility and accents unfamiliar to conventional Tate Britain audiences. I agreed, since the inaudibility actually seemed to communicate what the speakers were saying better than any translation might. This links perhaps to the impediments and my work with Amal Anon. Are you awake, by the way? Good, okay, just checking. How does this relate to the definitions of gallery education's function functions that in 2010 Carmen Mersch analysed as affirmative, reproductive, critically deconstructive, or transformative. While the sequence of Mersch's list appears graded, giving greater value to the potential function to transform the museum, I would also argue that the reproductive, that is, working with the children of existing visitors, which might suggest a conservatism, is of significance too. And I think back to the concept of reproductive labour that was generated by the Wages for Housework campaign in the 1970s. The integration of children into public life, moving them beyond children should be seen and not heard, can play a part in refuting the infantilization of education as the museum's site of philanthropy or its recent equivalent, corporate social responsibility. However, the work we produced intentionally crossed age, experience, and education levels. As part of a cross-cultural strategy, after consulting artists and curators from Black and ethnic minorities, I introduced a new post of curator of cross-cultural programs, working within the public programs team with a specific task of working with intellectuals and others. The aim was to inform and shift the museum both for existing and potential employees as much as for audiences or participants. This included, for instance, integrating Tate's security guards into education projects, but that's another story. We also developed training projects to support Black and minority ethnic artists and curators at various career stages, and some of them have actually gone on to, 3 minutes, thank you. I won't tell you what they've gone on to do. From experimental short-term projects, we started to develop longer-term research projects. One way the ethnographic project, one was the academic ethnographic project Tate Encounters. Another non-academic project was with support with the British Council, the one I've mentioned. Over 6 years, I led Nakhnu Together on behalf of Tate, with partners first in London and Damascus, and then additionally in Amman. The question of voice in Nakhnu Together was something that I have continued to reflect on and involved anxiety for many participants, as well sometimes as dispute, illustrated by the lack of trust about subtitling the film. Over the 6 years, the project continually shifted as those involved learned more about each other and our cultures. National politics led to my former colleague Amal Anon and me both leaving our jobs. Her change of job was related to Syria's civil war. My departure from Tate was associated with the increasing shift from a statutory to a corporatized public sector in Britain. This year, the year before I left Tate, a staff survey was undertaken as part of a change management, in quotes, process linked. It revealed that a common experience in the education team was a sense that my colleagues felt unrecognized in the museum for their significant labor, for which they worked long hours to an exceptionally high standard. This was the negative of being under the radar. However, the vocalization of this did not necessarily produce either change or recognition. The sense of not being heard was, in fact, further reduced by process. In the year before I left Tate, I started a personal 5-year multivocal project called Begin Again. I had discontinued my studio practice for the 10 years in which I had been full-time institutional employment. I invited some of those I'd worked with in that decade of not painting to sit for me in a process I've called dialogic portraits. Quite a few were former Tate colleagues. Each sitting produced 2 portraits of the 76 sitters, as well as conversation, followed by my own reflexive writing and a recorded interview with each. This work contained several complexities around voice. And I'm going to skip that bit because it's now down to 1 minute, so I'll go on. One sitter summed up what many had expressed. He said that the experience of sitting for his portrait made him feel as if he had been shown to exist. From a series of 21 small books which I produced from Begin Again, I made a limited edition in 2 volumes, a set of which is now in Tate's artist's book collection. Perhaps archived, it can offer the museum the possibility of hearing its own voices unheard elsewhere, continuing perhaps from Hogarth's portrayal around 1770 of his servants, rather than the 2009 staff survey. Sorry, I've skipped something here. There we are. Back to the impossible artwork. A quotation by bell hooks that I included in the 2013 article, What Does Globalization Mean for Education in the Art Museum, has been hovering in my mind for years. It's no need to hear your voice when I can talk about you better than you can speak about yourself. No need to hear your voice. Only tell me about your pain. I want to know your story, and then I will tell it back to you in a new way. Tell it back to you in such a way that it has become mine, my own. Rewriting you, I rewrite myself anew. I am still author, authority. I am still colonizer, the speaking subject, and you are now at the center of my talk. Finally, last summer, I managed to shift the inhibition this quote produced in me when I became absolutely certain that it is far too dangerous for Amal Anon to make her work, to tell her story herself, even to tell me the detail, and that I had, in some sense, to listen hard to what she says and what she doesn't say, to what she can send and what she can't, and speak and make as close as possible to mean with rather than for her, an artist as well as an advocate, working alongside her to enable her to become known of, known by, and seen to exist. However, last autumn I went to the feminist pedagogy mobilization at Valland Art Academy in Gothenburg, and there it was, given pride of place hovering on the window, the bell hooks quote. This is, of course, both a literal and an emblematic institutionalization of a form of thinking with implications for artists, curators, institutions, and the concept of an improvising or dialogic practice. While an understanding of Hooks's meaning is essential as well as invaluable, we need also to recognize the specifics of the local within the global and not assume that all speaking for or with is also speaking over. It might be speaking through. Just as I have listened to institutional colleagues and studio portrait sitters, I want to enable anyone, I want to enable anyone who will listen to hear the voice produced through Amal Anon's silence prescripted labor. She is not a refugee. She is not someone's wife. She's not the subaltern's wife. She is an artist stuck in a terrifying and a stultifying situation. We continue to work together, attempting to make the impossible artwork. However, we are no longer operating with the familiar institutional codes for working in partnership. It is necessarily improvisational, neither knowing where we're going nor what contingencies we'll be working with next. Part of the work of the impossible artwork is to make my collaborators' labor credible, to be in imaginary dialogue, even if hearing her voice only by proxy. The impossible artwork has to be made precisely to stand up against its impossibility. Thank you.